All right, that looks like that is working. Give it a second for people to find their way in.
Rabbi, can we go over the difference between challah and teruma?
Yes, of course, but that's kind of where we're starting. So. All right, so just
on a side, I can't remember if it was this or a different chapter. The first fruits, were they given to the priests or did they have to be eaten in Jerusalem?
no, they were shared, I guess would be the right word.
Because I thought I remember it said you could redeem them.
Yes, and that is not, sorry, that's just trying to get things lined up. That's not for tonight, by the way, but yes. There we are. All right. We are running a little late because of some computer difficulties, so let's go ahead and get started. A little housekeeping before we jump in, however. Next week is the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and is normal. I expect many people to be either traveling or working with their families to prepare. And so there is no class next Wednesday evening, that day before Thanksgiving. No class next Wednesday. Okay. But let us begin or continue Beitzah. We are in chapter 1, and we are picking up at Mishnah 6. A reminder, because I know the concept of Beitzah is still new to many of us. Beitzah, the Masechet itself, is dealing not only with eggs, but with the topic of what can we do on Yom Tov, on a day of a festival, that we wouldn't normally be able to do on a Shabbat, because of the special permission the Torah gives for the preparation of food for the soul on this day. And as we're going to see from Mishnah 6 and others tonight, we're going to be referring back to our general concept that you are allowed to do such preparations as necessary on Yom Tov that could not be done prior to the holiday without a significant degradation of the quality of the food. So that's our benchmark, that if you have to do it on the day, it's going to be permitted, again, as a rule of thumb. And if you could have done it yesterday, the day before the holiday, then it's not going to be permitted on the day of the holiday. You should just plan better next time. So that's the general rule, but we have to go through a bunch of different examples in order to get, well, a full understanding. All right, so Mishnah 6 is going to deal with the concepts of challah, as well as the gifts that were given to the priest. Now, these gifts are the gifts that were their portions from the animals that had been sacrificed. There were certain parts of the animal that belonged to the priests, meaning they got to eat them, and those portions are their gifts. Challah, if you are trying to remember, is not only the nickname we give to the bread that we eat on Friday night and Saturday for Shabbat. Yes, we do call that challah, but the technical challah is the portion that is removed from the preparation of dough that is being made. It is given to the priest. In the ancient world, that would be your Kohen neighbor or someone else in the town. If you couldn't give it to the priest, then it had to be destroyed because it didn't belong to you, it belonged to them. There are many more rules about taking challah and how to handle that. Anyone who's curious, let me know. I can send you some resources. But here we're dealing with the preparation of the challah, this portion that would be pinched out of the dough to be given to the priest, or the extra pieces of the sacrificial animal that, again, are to be given to the priest. And the question for this Mishnah is, well, can I give that or prepare it in the first place on Yom Tov to give to the priest? Everyone have the basic outline then? Okay. Beit Shammai says, one may not take challah or priestly gifts to a priest on Yom Tov whether they were separated on the day before or on that day. But Beit Hillel permits it. So I'm not going to go into their argument too much because that's the next part of the Mishnah. But just make sure you understand Beit Shammai, as is normal, is being a little more restrictive of what they think, that we couldn't take the challah and give it to the priest. We couldn't take the extra portions of the animal and give it to the priest, even if they were separated in advance, meaning on the day before the holiday. But Beit Hillel allows it to be done on the day itself. Now, why? Here's the explanation. Beit Shammai said to them, an analogy supports our view. Challah and the priestly gifts go to the priest, and Truma, likewise, goes to the priest. Just as one may not take Truma to the priest, meaning on the day of Yom Tov, so one may not take to him the priestly gifts. So the basic idea is that you are not allowed to give Truma on that day because one is not allowed to separate the Truma. Truma is kind of like an additional tax on our harvests. It is a proportion of what we have grown that we have to give to the priest. And since we are not allowed to separate it, to designate Truma, which could be even done verbally on the Yom Tov, then we can't deliver it on Yom Tov, obviously. Thus, we can make an analogy, says Beit Shammai, that just as Truma, which we cannot give to the priest on Yom Tov, we should also look at the priestly portions and the priestly challah, which likewise would follow the same logic. If we can't give Truma, we shouldn't be able to give these other gifts as well. That's Beit Shammai's logic. Beit Hillel responds, Beit Hillel said to them, no. If you say in the case of Truma, which he has not the right to separate, you will say the same. Will you say the same with respect to priestly gifts, which he is permitted to separate? So Beit Hillel sort of attacks the underlying logic. If the reason you're giving is for not bringing these gifts is because you can't separate Truma, well, then your analogy falls apart, because priestly gifts are allowed to be separated on the day, and thus the analogy is not fit. It's not comparable. There is a difference in the law for Truma from these gifts, and if there is a difference, then just making an analogy is not sufficient. An analogy only works when there are no substantive legal differences between the two topics. And Beit Hillel is pointing out that there is a major difference between them. In fact, the very difference that seems to be your underlying concern. And thus, we should be allowed to bring challah and the priestly gifts on Yom Tov, even if we would not be allowed to bring Truma, because Truma has its own law. Questions on that point?
What are the laws on the priestly gift?
I'm not going to go through all the different portions. We talked about that in Hulin, I believe, where we talked about the cheek and some of the other portions of the animal that were that belong to the priest. But review that section and you'll see more about that. I know the Mishnah likes to wander, but I want to stay a little bit on topic so we can continue with Beitzah. Mishnah 7 then. So Mishnah 7 is beginning, is turning to a new topic, but it's the same theme. And the question here is about spices. Most of us are very fortunate, maybe you might think so, because we have a little rack full of spices. You take it out, you unscrew it, you shake it into your food, and you're done. And you might have a whole bunch of them, a collection of spices. Well, in the ancient world, that wasn't the usual way that you had spices. Usually, you would grind the spices. You would have like a wooden or stone container, and you'd have something heavy that you would pound on the spices to break them into pieces and turn them into powder. That's what grinding is. We are fortunate because someone else also ground it for us. That was the company we bought it from. But in the ancient world, that wasn't usually an option. Now, partly the reason it wasn't the usual option is because once you grind the spices, they would begin to lose their flavor. The freshly ground pepper is better than the pepper that's just been sitting in the cupboard, and certainly better than sitting just in a bowl like the ancient world where you didn't have proper coverings and other ways of maintaining a spice from going stale. So the issue would be, can I grind? Now, everybody agrees, as Dr. Culp points out in his introduction, that yes, you can grind. You need to be able to grind your spices. It is an essential element of cooking, and grinding them before the day would be absolutely reducing the goodness of the meal. So grinding them on the day, that's not the problem. The problem is, how do I grind them on the day? Beit Shammai says, spices may be crushed with a wooden pestle and salt in a small cruse or with a wooden ladle. So use a wooden pestle, which is not the normal way. Normally you would crush them with stone, or use them in a ladle or a small cruse, meaning another type of container, rather than using the normal container for crushing. This is what's known as a shinui. We talked about this a little bit last week as well. It means doing it with a difference. Yes, it's allowed, but only just barely is the emotion behind this. And it's only allowed if you are doing something to make it very distinguishable from your regular type of grinding. You shouldn't just grind and take it for granted. You should grind it in a way that makes you realize it's special and we're kind of sort of being given permission. It's right on the edge of acceptable, so we do it a little bit different. So that's Beit Shammai's position. Beit Hillel, following the pattern we've seen now quite a few times, Beit Hillel says spices may be crushed in the usual way with a stone pestle, and salt with a wooden pestle. That you can absolutely do it in the normal way. You don't need to take any special changes. No shinui is needed. The grinding is 100% allowed. And this is an interesting aspect of Shabbat observance as well as Yom Tov observance, where sometimes you have something which seems only maybe sort of permitted. And the issue then becomes, well, is it permitted with a shinui, with a change, or is it permitted 100%? I know some people who try to straddle the line on the topic of electricity on Shabbat, and they will say, well, yes, I understand halakhically it probably is permitted, and certainly on Yom Tov, most of them would agree, but they're uncomfortable nonetheless. And so they'll do it with a shinui. They will turn on the light switch with their elbow rather than with their fingers, because that puts a little bit of a difference on the feeling of it. Now, I do not believe that is necessary. I think Jewish law is quite clear on the rulings of electricity for Shabbat, but I know many people who have other opinions on that, and that's part of the joy of being in a diverse Jewish world. I have talked about electricity on Shabbat in my Pathway to Judaism class about Shabbat, so go ahead and take a look at that if you want to know more. But we're not going to go into electricity any more than that. But are there any questions about crushing and grinding from this part of the Mishnah of Beitza? Okay. 1-8. Oh, come on. So one of the other Av Melachot, the primary categories of work that we are not allowed to do on Shabbat is sorting. We are not allowed to sift out the bad parts of food. So the example we're going to get here is a pile of beans. So just imagine you have a bunch of dried beans, or maybe even wet, like that you were pulling out of the peed pods, and you would often do this in a sort of big pile, and some of the shells, the casing, would be all mixed in. Now, on Shabbat, we normally would not be able to sort this out from the good parts and the bad parts. But on Yom Tov, well, we're preparing our food and we are about to cook and we want it to be the best food possible. So we need to get rid of the yucky bits. So is it allowed or not allowed? Well, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel are going to disagree. One who sorts beans on Yom Tov, Beit Shammai says he must sort the edible parts and eat, meaning eat it right away. So he is of the opinion that the sorting is only allowed if you are picking from the pile and eating them as you go, because you need to show that this action is part of the eating process. Because otherwise you would be making the good pile and the bad pile, and that's something that you could have done the day before. That, you know, would be something that could have been prepared earlier. So he is allowing it because it does seem partially important for the cooking of the day, but he is putting limits on how we can do it. Beit Hillel takes a different opinion. Beit Hillel says he may sort as usual, but in his lap or in a basket or in a dish, but not with a board or with a sifter or a sieve. So he says, yes, you can sort, but Beit Hillel agrees there needs to be a difference, a shinui. So we're not using our regular metal container that we would shake and sift it through. We're not using our normal style of sifting. We're using a different way of sifting. And that kind of sorting is allowed because it is on the edge, but you don't have to go straight into the pot, straight into your mouth. It can be gathered a little bit more. And then before I take your question, Aaron, let me get Rabban Gamliel's opinion. He may even rinse in water and skim off the refuse. Rabban Gamliel says it may not be the most efficient way, but it's better than what these two guys are talking about. Throw them in the water, let the bad stuff float to the top, and just scoop off the bad stuff, and you'll be good. I will point out, Rabban Gamliel's opinion is rejected. That is too much like regular run-of-the-mill sifting, and it's definitely something that is crossing the line. And Ness, Aaron, your question.
Yes, Rabbi. Hey, just out of curiosity, my understanding that the reason for all this is because the rabbis, the hog was set aside for enjoyment, so they wanted to allow stuff to increase the enjoyment on hog, but they didn't want people to work for enjoyment on a different day because that would be stealing from hog. They'd be working on hog for a weekday.
So definitely there is an issue about preparing things on Hag for weekdays, but we're going to look at that in much more detail when we get to the Mishnah that talks about when the festival and Shabbat come back to back. But you are right in general that a person would not be allowed to deliberately do work only for the weekday while it is on Hag. So we can't bake a loaf of bread just for next Tuesday if today is the festival. That definitely is not allowed. But they do also want to recognize that some work, technical work, melacha, was needed in order to prepare for the needs of the day. And so this is now trying to find the line of how much work is needed or not needed, how much should have been prepared in advance.
But it's my understanding too is that they wanted to allow work on hog when necessary to increase the enjoyment of hog.
Yes.
And it looks like here they want everybody to know that they're working for the enjoyment of hog and nothing else.
Well, it's not a question in this particular Mishnah, I think, about whether they're working for the enjoyment of the Chag or not. It's a question of, am I allowed to sift at all when such sifting might have been better done in advance? And it seems to be that this is a border case, that maybe the sifting on the day would be better or more appropriate for the cooking process. But it is so close to the border that even Beit Hillel realizes or recognizes it should be done with this additional change. They're not explicitly talking about the rest of the week preparations. everybody would agree that you can't sit and sift your beans on Chag for next Tuesday.
Right, I get that, but it looks like my reading of this, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the purpose for sifting the beans in a less efficient manner is so that nobody thinks you're preparing this for tomorrow, and they want to make sure everybody knows this is for enjoyment of today.
I don't think that it's necessarily a marit ayin, the appearance of the thing issue, because a person might be doing this, perfectly privately. It's more a question of it's allowed, but it's on the edge of being allowed. And when things are on the edge of being allowed, but yet still allowed, oftentimes there is this shinui, this differentiation that takes place in order to make it happen. And that's something that happens in Shabbat as well.
But if you make it more difficult to shift through the beans and take longer and more work, doesn't that take away from Hog versus the regular, more efficient way?
So you might argue that, absolutely. But I would point out two things. One, the word work or halacha, for malacha, is not just about how much effort does something take. The rabbis were concerned not with the number of watts or horsepower needed, but they were concerned about the actual work that was needed as a technical category. That's why, writing a line with a pencil is not allowed on Chag, even though that is incredibly simple. But starting to cook my roast beef would be permitted, even though that's going to involve a lot more work in terms of the preparation and of the meat, and if I'm stripping it from the bone or whatever else I'm doing. So it's not about how hard it is and whether or not the difficulty adds or subtracts from our enjoyment of the festival. It's about, does it cross a line of the technical category of malacha, of work? And if so, then it's prohibited. If not, it's permitted. And if it's on the edge, then we do it differently.
Yeah, but the example you gave fits within the logic that the purpose of cooking your roast or whatever you're cooking is for the enjoyment of Hog, while the writing of the letter is not.
Oh, don't get me started. The number of ways that people try to convince themselves that I will enjoy the festival much more if I'm allowed to do my watercolors because I love painting, and the festival will seem terrible if I don't. I will enjoy the festival much more if I can just jot down this note so I don't forget to, call my business partner after the festival and talk about this issue. Otherwise, I will be worrying about it all festival. I will enjoy the festival much more if I can go shopping and buy my favorite new shoes than if I'm not allowed to shop because the sale is going to run out and then I won't get them tomorrow. People can convince themselves of their ways to enjoy a festival, or Shabbat for that matter, that violate the melacha, the work requirements or work limitations, very, very easily. As I once heard it put, humans are not a rational animal, we are a rationalizing animal. And we can come up with excuses with very easy, we're very creative at coming up with those excuses. So it's not just about a personal definition. I will point out that in the reform movement, that is more the argument that they take, that is one of the major distinctions between the reform movement view of these topics and the conservative movement view of these topics. That in the reform movement, the question would be, how will it make you feel? And if it makes you feel better, then they would consider that permitted. But both the Mishnah and the conservative movement do not read that as being the primary measure.
So actually, that's a good thing you point out, the reform movement, because I thought within traditional Judaism, when they talk about enjoyment on Hog, they're talking about community enjoyment, where in the reform movement, it seems to be more personal.
Certainly, we are strongly encouraged to participate in communal enjoyment. We are asked to share when we have extra in order that those who have less can also enjoy the festivals. But that's not I wouldn't use that as a litmus test of enjoyment with the community is more important than enjoyment without, or that somehow if you're enjoying the festival without your community, that you're violating a huge mitzvah. some people had only enough for them and their family. And that doesn't mean they shouldn't enjoy with them and their family for that festival. I wouldn't want to force them to invite guests that they simply cannot afford. So it's not quite a bright red line about community or not. And also in defense of the reform ideology, while it might not be mine, the reform world is very community organized or oriented. And I'm sure they would believe and argue back that their exceptions, their permission, allows the community to enjoy together even more. I know many of my reform colleagues are comfortable using Zoom technology like this on a festival or on Shabbat. And they say that it brings their community much closer together. I am not comfortable, and I don't think that my understanding of halakha permits it. Does that mean that my community is missing out? Maybe a little, because we're not able to make a two-way communication for those types of holidays that people who can't make it in person would absolutely appreciate. But even though we might benefit communally from it, I would consider it to be stepping over the line of halakha.
But Rabbi, by community enjoyment, I meant like if you're painting a picture or writing some business document or whatever in your room, then you're isolating yourself from the community and not celebrating it with the community. Where I understand
but again, Aaron, it's very easy to rationalize. Okay, so I'll do a painting class with the community, or I'll paint a mural with the community. It's not the painting in and of itself that's the issue. For what you're talking about, it's anything can be rationalized as a community activity. Even my business work can be rationalized, because if I'm able to close this deal, I'll be able to make a huge donation to tzedakah. It's not hard to rationalize anything as being permissible if there are no limits that are outside of our control. And that's one of the things that I love about Judaism, is that it puts limits that are beyond our control, so that we're not able to rationalize them. That's part of what makes me a more traditionally minded member of the Jewish people, because I think that that's liberating, and that is a way of sanctifying the time that is set aside that can't be duplicated by just what I feel I'm doing. I need my feelings to be guided by the tradition to really feel that connection, rather than just convincing myself that this is a good thing or a nice thing to do.
Yeah. And actually, that's a good point. So I was wondering, were these rules meant to put forth an objective standard to achieve whatever goals it's trying to achieve?
Well, I mean, it's meant to put forward an objective standard, which is always going to have a subjective application. So, the idea of what could have been prepared better in advance, that will be debated, and different communities will end up with different standards, and individuals may end up with slightly different standards on some topics. And that's okay. That's why we have multiple books written on halakha that disagree with each other on some of the finer points. But the broad strokes here are relatively respected and understood. All right, Mishnah 1:9. Oh, come on. So we talked a little bit about bringing gifts to our Kohanim for Yom Tov, but what if I want to bring a gift to a neighbor, to just a regular, not Kohen person? What am I allowed to provide? Well, Beit Shammai says one may not send gifts to a neighbor on Yom Tov except portions. Now, portions is a technical term which Dr. Kolp is showing us means of food ready to be eaten. So this is food that is ready to go. It is ready to be just taken, and enjoyed, that it's not going to be expecting the neighbor to prepare it for themselves. That if I were to put them in the position to have to prepare it for themselves, then perhaps they either will not be able to, because some of the preparation might have been better done the day before, or they might do it anyway and thus transgress and prepare things in ways they shouldn't be prepared on the day of Chag. But Beit Hillel says one may send cattle, game, and poultry, whether alive or slaughtered. One may also send wine, oil, flour, or pulse, but not grain. All right. So what does Beit Hillel say? He's like, look, technically you can slaughter animals on Yom Tov, and technically you can use wine, oil, or flour, even though they're normally mixed and prepared, sometimes in ways that you shouldn't be doing, sometimes in ways you should. That's fine. The same thing with pulse. But grain would need to be, or could have been easily and perfectly fine prepared the day before. And so if you send grain, then you're not actually sending them anything they can use. And since you are still not allowed to move items from one place to another on the festival, just as you can't on Shabbat, the grain then becomes a prohibited transfer. The other things are permitted only because they could be used on the Yom Tov. So that's why grain gets a special category. Just to finish it off, Rabbi Shimon permits even grain. Rabbi Shimon says, well, maybe you're not allowed to cook it, or not allowed to grind it up into flour, but there's other ways to eat grain by baking it and roasting it, and that means it still is technically permitted. Rabbi Shimon loses his argument, and we still don't send grain, basically because flour is the primary form of grain's use, and just because you could conceive of another use doesn't mean that you're allowed to send it on Yom Tov. It's actually a very nice follow-up to our earlier discussion about rationalization, that just because you could rationalize it doesn't mean that it becomes permissible. Any questions then on 1.9? All right, let's take a look at 1.10. And we are talking here about clothing. And we're going to see that, yes, there are ways to send clothing, and that might surprise you. But I will remind you from last week's discussion that the permission that the Torah gives for preparations on Yom Tov also includes other things that are not purely food items, that it is also for the nefesh, the spirit in general. Now, there are going to be certain issues with clothing, but in principle, there are things that can be sent. One may send clothes, whether they are sewn up or not sewn up, or even though there is kilaim, that is to say mixed wool and linen in them, provided they are necessary for the festival. Okay, so the kilaim, the mixture between wool and linen, shatnez as it's called, hopefully you'll be aware of that from other study. Even though that means you can't wear it, there are other ways that a person can use the fabric, whether it be for decoration or as padding. There are other uses for that. And if it is actually being used for the festival, then it is allowed. The sewn up or not sewn up is a little bit more difficult for a modern person to understand. But in the ancient world and even through the Middle Ages, clothing was often left in a slightly unfinished form, and then it would be finished off just at the last minute, sometimes even sewing the person into a garment if it was very special for the day. This is before they had easy buttonholes and things like that. And so the issue is, if it's not quite sewn up, it's not quite finished, and you certainly aren't allowed to sew it on the day, but because it has potentially other uses, in this case, that are permitted, like, again, decoration or blankets, then it is allowed to be transferred on the day. All right, questions on that part before we get to some footwear?
Rabbi, are you allowed to sew kalim together?
You are not allowed to wear it. You are allowed to sew it, but you are not allowed to wear it.
All right, because I thought you couldn't even grow the crops together, and I thought you couldn't have like a kalim carpet or anything.
So growing the crops together is prohibited, but that's in general. We don't mix our crops without certain guidelines. But there are some ways that it can be used.
I thought that came from kalim, about not mixing the crops or even mixing the cattle that do work.
Again, there are many different layers to what is and isn't permitted in this. So whether it be crops, whether it be the fabric, or whether it be animals working as a team, that's beyond the scope of tonight's discussion. However, we do get to talk about a very interesting little bit of footwear. One may not send nailed sandals or unfinished shoes. Unfinished, very clear. If it's not finished, we can't wear them. And if we can't wear them, then they have no business being traveled and transferred on Yom Tov. But nailed sandals, meaning they have hobnails. It would be the term in I guess, oldish English. I don't think anyone talks about it much anymore. These would be sandals that had heavy metal studs at the bottom. And this would be a reinforcement for the sandals. But it also led to something that is off page, a very unfortunate situation where people were hiding from enemies, and there was a rumor that the enemies were about to find them, and it started a human crush, a wave or stampede, if you will. And the ruling was that more people died from the hobnailed sandals than died from the enemy. That the sandals, because they were reinforced and tough and really quite dangerous, they became deadly in that crush. So this, the rabbi said, you shouldn't be wearing hobnailed sandals on Shabbat or then just on Yom Tov. And that means that since you can't wear them, you can't transfer them. Make sense? Okay. And finally, sorry, one more shoe issue before we get to a general rule. Rabbi Yehuda says, not even white shoes, because they still require an artisan to blacken them. So apparently in his community, white shoes were not worn because nobody wore white shoes. And if you didn't wear white shoes, then that meant you couldn't transfer white shoes, even if they were finished in every other respect, because in their community, it was unfinished. Now, this is a great opportunity, I think, to try and explain that this is showcasing how in the Mishnah, as well as in the Talmud and later rabbinic literature, the local norms of a community would often matter. That you can't just say, oh, I can transfer these shoes because they're complete, if in your communities, it doesn't actually technically meet the definition of completeness, because nobody would wear them like that. If nobody's going to wear white shoes because everybody had to always darken their shoes before they went out, then you can't move them around on Yom Tov, even if in a different community, it might be okay, because people wear those types of shoes in that state all the time. So too in the modern world, we have to sometimes be honest with ourselves of what we do or don't permit or expect people to wear in the regular workaday life. And we can't look for exploitations and loopholes just because our life looks different than the life of someone in the Mishnah. That we have to sometimes update the status. And also that means that we have to update the status and sometimes in ways that allow for permission. Although Rabbi Yehuda's opinion doesn't hold in general, because it's unique to his community, if his community was alive today and people had begun to wear white shoes, because as we know now, many people will wear white shoes all the time, then that would need to be updated as well, because white shoes became normal. And once it became normal, then the reason for the prohibition disappears, and thus the prohibition itself disappears. This is just like I said, a good reminder, a showcase that just because something was prohibited in the past does not mean it will remain prohibited always, that sometimes the social structure changes, and if the prohibition was based upon that social structure, then the prohibition will also disappear. And then we'll just finish off with the general rule, the klal as it's described. Whatever may be used on Yom Tov may also be sent on Yom Tov. And there again, we have to be honest and examine things in particular and look into them in depth. What actually can be used on Yom Tov? If it can, then fine. You can go ahead and send it, and it doesn't violate the prohibition on transfer. If you can't use it on Yom Tov, then I'm sorry, you're not allowed to move it any more than anything else that would be categorically prohibited on Yom Tov. Again, I can't send a beautiful fountain pen to my friend because he's not going to be able to use that on Yom Tov. But I could send him a saw if he needs the saw to cut up his wonderful roast beef into smaller chunks for the rest of us. So it's not about the item in and of itself, but about its potential use for a legitimate purpose on Yom Tov. All right, questions or comments? Okay, then I actually have a board meeting that I need to be attending that is working simultaneously to this one. That's why I had trouble getting the link up and running before we started, which means we're going to wrap up for tonight so that I have some time to finish up in the meeting over there. I'm pointing to the next Zoom meeting I'm about to go to. Once again, we will not be meeting next week, so I'll see you in 2 weeks. Make sure you enjoy your Thanksgiving. It may not be an official Jewish holiday, but it is still a wonderful Jewish themed holiday in keeping with our idea of all the time giving thanks. I hope that you have a great time with your family, friends, or whomever you're celebrating with. And I will see you all in 2 weeks for Mishnah, and we'll pick up with chapter 2. I hope to see you earlier than that, of course, for Shabbat, for my Torah class, or any of the other amazing things that we get to do together.